Hey guys, Eric here. I want to cover doing a simple rebleed on the damper on all the MRP forks. This is in case some air has gotten into the damper and you need to do just a simple bleed, get that air out, just in case there's some honking that the customer's noticing when riding. So first thing we want to do is remove the compression cap through 3mm Allen. Just unthread the blue bolt out of the center there. Set that aside for later. And then remove the O-ring out of the center of the cap. And then very gently remove the cap off the top. And then take the detent balls off, because you don't want to lose these, as they can go running around the shop pretty easily. Next, take your 1.5mm Allen and loosen the two set screws on either side of the indexer. And just slide the indexer off the top. Next thing you want to do is make sure the damper rod is all the way down in the fully extended position, and then take your 24mm socket for loop forks and then 28mm socket for stage forks, and just thread the damper off of the top of the fork. The damper cap unthreaded, just pull it straight up and out of the top. Then remove the O-ring from around the outside of the damper cap. Inspect it for any damage to the O-ring. This can sometimes happen when you tighten down the cap, so just inspect that. If it's damaged in any way, replace that O-ring. Then take the damper cap and thread the valve tool onto the damper cap with 4mm Allen down inside the valve tool. You can just thread this on there. You want to bring it down just nice and snug. You don't need to get it super tight. And then take the tool and you want to open the valve, so turn it counterclockwise about half a turn. That way the valve is in the all the way open position. At this time, just set the damper valve and your 4mm Allen off to the side. And you want to take your fork oil. We're using a 5-weight fork oil, and just fill up the stanchion right up to the top, and just very gently cycle the damper until you have all the air out. There are a series of holes in the damper tube down inside here. Just make sure that oil level never drops below those holes. So if you do have quite a bit of air, you may want to fill this up a couple of times. Make sure you're doing this over some sort of a bin, because you're going to be allowing some oil to overflow over the top. That's perfectly fine. And just cycle this multiple times until you get no more air rising to the top in the stanchion and out of the damper tube. Alright. Now that you've gotten all the air risen out of the stanchion and out of the damper tube, just wipe off any air bubbles that are on the top of the stanchion here. And very gently pull the damper rod all the way down to full extension Again, making sure you don't let the oil level drop below those holes in the damper tube. You don't want to be sucking any air in now that you've already evacuated all the air out. Once the damper rod hits full extension, just fill up all the way to the top. Take your damper valve and your bleed reservoir and slide the bleed reservoir down over the valve tool and onto the top of the cap. Take your 1.5 millimeter Allen and thread the 2 set screws on either side of the bleed reservoir down lightly snug. You don't want to get them too tight. And then move the O-ring down over those set screws. Now gently insert the damper valve down into the damper tube and onto the stanchion, and thread the whole assembly down until it's lightly snug onto the crown. At this point, you want to grab the damper rod and compress the fork, pushing oil up through the damper cap and into the bleed reservoir. By compressing the damper first, you're pushing all the air straight up and out instead of possibly sucking some air down into the damper. Once you see some oil up into the bleed reservoir, you can top off the bleed reservoir with your oil and then stroke the fork a few times. Just slowly making sure all the air is evacuating out of the dampening system. Now that you have most of the air out of the dampening system, take your 4 millimeter and put it into the valve tool and turn the valve tool counterclockwise while you're stroking the damper rod. This is allowing the damper valve to open and close a few times, just making sure that we've evacuated air out of every little point of the damper valve. Alright, now that you've done that a few times, just cycle the damper 10 or 15 more times, making sure we get all of the air out of the dampening system. Alright, now that we're sure that we have all of the air out of the dampening system, we want to bring the damper all the way down to the fully extended position, and you want to pop this O-ring from off of the 2 little set screws with your 1.5 millimeter Allen. You want to loosen both of these set screws. And just very gently lift the bleed reservoir off of the damper cap, allowing any excess oil to kind of pour out over the sides, and then you're going to leave this nice little pool of oil around the edge of the damper cap. Take either a new O-ring, or if the other O-ring off of the damper cap was not damaged, just very gently install that onto the damper cap with your fingers. Bring it down nice and snug. That way we don't chance any air getting into the damper. Take your 4mm wrench and take the valve tool off of the damper cap. Now take your 24mm socket and tighten the damper down lightly snug. We don't need to get this super tight. And if we get it too tight, we could damage that O-ring and allow air to get into the dampening system. So now just give everything a good wipe down. You're going to have a lot of oil pooled on the crown here. So just give everything a good wipe down. And now you can reclock the damper. Take your compression knob and your blue screw. Tighten down the blue screw snug, and then bring the compression knob closed so that we're sure that the damper is in the fully closed position. Remove the blue screw. Remove your compression knob, and then install your indexer. Remember, you want the raised side of the indexer to your right, and then you want to put that little notch at the top of the indexer just barely past the 12 o'clock position. And then with your 1.5mm Allen, lightly tighten down the set screws on either side of the indexer. The indexer securely in place. Put the detent balls back on. Take your compression knob. Now put the tang back at the 6 o'clock position. And make sure that it hits the the raised section of the indexer so that you're not causing any binding. The little O-ring that was in the top of the compression knob, and then the blue screw. Tighten that all down into place. Bring it nice and snug. And then open and close the compression valve, making sure that everything's moving freely and you're not getting any binding or missing any of the detent balls. With the damper in the fully closed position, just sit here and cycle the damper a few times, making sure you don't get any honks. You can also push on the table with just the rod, making sure you're not getting any honks, and just compress the fork multiple times even after you have it back together, making sure we don't have any audible honk noises when you're pushing on it on the floor at varying speeds or anything, because that's a sign that you still have some air inside the dampening system.